All right, thank you so much for joining us for our second breakout session. You're here for the path forward, taking big ideas from pilot to scale, sustainability, and impact. And I just wanted to quickly introduce our moderator, Lena Nilsson from the Blum Center for Developing Economies.
I think I'm mic'd here. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm really excited for this panel and for this discussion of an important and very large remaining issue, I think, in social enterprise. How we move from our first kind of success stories about proof of principle into more systemic change, like we've seen maybe with mobile money and microfinance, but not so much across a broader spectrum of social enterprise globally and here in the US. So I'm going to introduce our series of panelists here who are really exciting and diverse, including by how long they've existed. We have an enterprise that started in 2000, one from 2006, and one that was born in 2014. And we also have a representative, Kimberly Dasher-Tripp, from an organization that supports social enterprises. So I think we're going to get some diverse perspectives, and I look forward to all of you asking hard questions. I'm going to start by introducing each one of you. Maybe you can say a few words about your organization and where you're at from a scaling perspective right now, and what's kind of the big thing coming up as you continue to scale and grow your enterprise. So we have Erin Ganju, who is the co-founder and CEO of Room to Read, which I think many of you probably heard about. It has 1,000 employees worldwide. It has built, I think, 10,000 schools, many libraries, has had great impact across 10 different countries. So maybe, Erin, you can talk a bit about that work.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Room to Read, as some of you may know, is a not-for-profit, and we focus on international education, and we are operating in 10 countries in Asia and Africa, and we work entirely in the government school system, in the primary and secondary school system, on 2 core programs, early grade literacy, and we've operated in over 17,000 communities now in our 15-year history. And a girls' education program where we have over 30,000 girls that we are helping get to the end of secondary school with key life skills and empowered to make their own decisions about their future lives. And so it's all about really creating ways to invest in the education system. And I think there's, in terms of scale, there's kind of 3 key phases we've gone through. Our early phase was definitely in the first 5 years was proof of concept and understanding how could we add value to the government education system in the countries that we were in. We then had a kind of scaling phase where we really focused on growth and implementing monitoring evaluation systems, a lot of data-driven systems to be able to help demonstrate how Room to Read's program is working versus control schools without our program. And now we're actually in an impact phase where we're actually looking at how do we build technical assistance and other capacity and training programs so that we can impact governments and other nonprofits at a greater scale at a faster rate by training them to implement our programs.
Thank you, Erin. Next we have Kimberly Dasher-Tripp, who is the founder and principal of Strategy for Scale. She was previously at the Skoll Foundation. She's written extensively about strategies for scaling or not scaling, kind of the challenges the social enterprises face, and has worked with a lot of different enterprises. And maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the common scaling challenges you see through your organization when you work with enterprises.
Sure, yeah. So I currently am consulting to both organizations and philanthropists who are thinking about this idea of scaling social impact. And part of the reason I'm so interested in all of this is, as Lena said, I used to work at the Skoll Foundation and I ran the Skoll Awards for Social Entrepreneurship. So I had the benefit of seeing hundreds of organizations every year who kind of thought of themselves in this growth phase, the kind of second phase that Erin was talking about, Room to Read being one of our grantees at that moment. And so in many ways, I am an issue generalist, but I'm more of a specialist in how you scale. So I'm a student of business models. And what I would say is, I think this is going to be everything that we talk about, but I think the biggest gaps to scaling are often the team that you have, the model that you're using to employ, and how quickly you're learning and iterating that model. And in a lot of ways, if you are picking your head up and trying to think about what are the barriers to success in the ecosystem I work within, and what are like the different players and the different levers I can pull to accelerate this change. And I think often people are so head down and focused on their program that they forget to pick their head up and see the context that they exist within, where there might be great opportunities to partner with governments, or as you'll hear, use different kinds of business models to attack the same problem. So I hope we get to talk about all that.
Yeah, I think so. As much as we can. Curtis Hemerly, who is the founder of Indaga, founded in 2014, out of UC Berkeley. Kimberly's also an MBA alum from here, I think, and Curtis from engineering. And Indaga provides cell phone access in remote rural areas, starting in Indonesia, and now also expanding more broadly, I think.
Yeah, so Indaga is a traditional VC-backed firm, for-profit, all of those pieces, with the goal of providing cellular connectivity to the roughly billion people still without it. And we do that by basically empowering communities. So we build a box that communities can own and operate that brings cell phone coverage to that area. They run their own local telecom. And as Lena mentioned, the company's only been around for a year. We got funded roughly 6 months ago. And so we're really right in the middle of the scale-up period. And hopefully I'll have some feedback to give on that.
It's super easy, right?
And finally, we also have Tevis Howard, who's the founder and CEO of Kumasa. I almost see you over there. It's a forestry company working in Kenya. So it's a mixed model. I saw somewhere called a microforestry model, microfinance, and sustainable forestry, working with farmers to reutilize their land in Kenya.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So Kumasa really is a vertically integrated forestry company, which means we go all the way from putting seedlings in the ground for about $1 a pop through to selling wood products on the back end. And that can range from a $10 fence post to a $150 electricity pole. And that ROI right there, $1 in and an average of 25 out, is a way to make a bunch of money for poor farmers. We face a challenge in that we really have two companies. One is a forestry company growing trees. We've scaled that fairly well, about 5,000 farmers, 1 million trees in the ground, managed mostly by a field extension network of about 125 staff. The challenge of the forestry industry and the opportunity, if you crack it, is it's a chicken and egg problem, and you have to build that wood products business, and we're just at that stage now that we're starting to get that up and running. So we have scaled to some extent and want to scale much faster the forestry company, and we're just in the early days of the wood products business, and it's hard to scale the former when you haven't built the latter. You have to be a pretty good storyteller. And along the way, we've gone from nonprofit through to for-profit financing, and see that is the way to scale up.
Fantastic. So there's this diversity here, I think, of perspectives and experiences. But one thing they all have in common is that they've been very financially successful and reward successful. Rewards, grants, VC funding in some cases to kind of begin to take that first step towards scaling or to continue to scale and grow, as it may be, depending on the organization. So maybe what we will focus on here today is what are some of the non-financial barriers too that feed into whether or not you're going to be able to grow your social enterprise. And I'd like to start with a question for Kimberly, kind of defining some of the terms in the title of this session. I mean, how do you even define scale or impact or sustainability? This comes, I know you've written and talked about the difference between scaling impact and scaling your organization. So I'd love to hear you describe that thought a bit.
Sure, yeah, it's something that I've thought quite a lot about, largely because the dialogue that's most prevalent, certainly among a lot of business schools, is about scaling your organization. So when you ask somebody and they say, talk to me about scale, I got in the habit over the past 6, 7 years of saying, what do you mean by scale? And 9 times out of 10 people said, staff size, budget size. And I said, well, you can have a really big organization and not do very good work. It doesn't necessarily, like one thing doesn't necessarily mean the other. I think that in the for-profit world, where we've borrowed some of these terms from, you would necessarily think if you are, getting more, getting further down the route, you're getting a, Series C, well then you've proven something and you can scale. So as we know from lots of bubbles bursting, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's pets.com. But so I think that, ultimately, what I would encourage us to talk about is scaling impact. And sometimes that requires a big organization, and sometimes that requires a small organization. And I hope that Lena will ask Aaron to talk about this difference between kind of being an implementing organization and being a technical assistance organization, and how you think about that balance. Because some of the interesting piece that I reflect on is very, very few organizations are going to grow to own the market that they're trying to disrupt. Very, very few. It's true for-profit, it's true nonprofit. I mean, not everybody's Google. In the for-profit space, we've got acquisitions, it's not perfect, but we've got acquisitions, we've got failure, we have, some version of growth. And in the nonprofit sector, it's kind of this like perennial, I don't know, just like forever existence unless somebody decides to stop funding them. And so what we have is like not enough of a forcing mechanism to say, well, who are you trying to affect? And I would argue that a lot of the real opportunity in scale is to, as I said, pick your head up and say, if we are wildly successful, what does the world look like, and who are the actors who are doing that? Sometimes it's governments, sometimes it's farmers are acting differently, sometimes it's ecosystems, supply chains, but it's about identifying like who are those players and how can I affect them, either with our model, our staff, our approach. But at some point, I would argue, you need to start open sourcing your impact. Sometimes you can charge for it, sometimes you partner for it, but that seems to me to be the greatest potential for scaling your impact, not just growing big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to take your recommendation and move to Aaron then and ask about this for Room to Read. Let's take that big vision and think about what does that mean for a specific organization. So for example, what are the organizational logistics and organizational scale that Room to Read needs to deliver quality programming at scale? And do you have people whose job it is to just think about social impact, or how do you structure that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually agree with everything Kimberly has said, and I'm a big fan of the thought process of going through and really challenging yourself in terms of defining scale, defining impact, defining a lot of these terms that are sort of thrown around. I will say, however, though, that it is very easy to talk about in theory, and it all sounds really good. At the end of the day, when you're in the trenches and you're doing it, you are doing whatever is in front of you to survive. And if anyone in this room could tell me differently that has started an organization, I'd be a really interested partner of yours to think about how did you do that without just going from one step to the next. Because we all have theories about how these things should work, and the reality is something is always happening at any given moment that doesn't make it work as perfectly as you would like in your head or in your plan. So from our perspective, of course it's about impact. No one has chosen, in particularly the nonprofit space, to go work for half of your salary, to work twice as long with half the tools of successful tools like IT or staff that you would in the for-profit space have, and go do one of the hardest things that you can in some of the most remote parts of the world, right? No one's doing this for the fun of it, really. You're doing it because you deeply care and you deeply are passionate about creating change. And yet, at the end of the day, what generally has prevented us from success is all the things that you would find in any organization. It's hiring talent. Number one challenge that we have is getting talent in the door and being able to retain them, because there's constantly competitive, in the countries that we are working in, there's constantly a competitive edge of somebody else being able to pay you a few $100s more down the road, which any family needs in the countries that we are in. The other one is being able to have the ability to work within the ecosystem. I mean, working in education, just as an example, there are a lot of actors in that sector, whether it be governments, whether it be teachers unions, whether it be a lot of different bodies that you're externally influenced by. So even if you have the perfect model, you're trying to create change. And one of the hardest things to do, I'm sure my other panelists would agree, is changing human behavior. It's a very hard thing to do. So all of these things have challenged us, and I guess the challenge that the way we approached it is we first had to go, as Room to Read, we went out and we wanted to scale ourselves as an organization large enough so that no one could say to us, oh, you did this in 5 schools, but how could you do it in 30 schools, 30,000 schools in our country, right? So we said, okay, well, let's partner with the government and do it in hundreds and thousands now of schools, so that it's not just a nice pilot that worked in a certain community or certain set. And that took a lot of buy-in, and it took many, many years. It took us 7 years, for example, in Vietnam, to get them to change a 5-minute reading period into a 30-minute reading period in their curriculum schedule. 7 years of just going back and working on showing them the data. So these things are not quick changes. It's very easy as an investor to say, hey, why aren't you scaling faster? Well, I don't have the power as, to be able to change a government's, curriculum. I don't have the power necessary, with all those actors. And so I think those things are, time is somewhat irrelevant. And I think a lot of these discussions, it's more about, what stage are you? Once we prove that we could do this in thousands of schools, now we're in a place where we can look at technical assistance, because we have, bodies of data of what's worked in multiple countries, multiple communities with multiple different kinds of other actors, and we can now pull from that and say, oh, this situation looks a little bit like this one. Here's maybe an approach that, we can look at training somebody else. And so I think that's phases that you go through. I don't think as a small organization you can start right away just thinking about, other people adopting your model. I think you have to go through a lot of scaling up yourself to be able to get to that place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so you kind of started talking here about some of the inside factors, the factors within the organization. I guess there's the team, the resources you have, technological and otherwise. And
I was going to say, and that's to your point, Lena, I actually think it's every single person's job at Room to Read to think about social impact. Mm-hmm. Like if you're a fundraiser, you have to be able to articulate that. If you're, a program design person, if you're, even if you're on the accounting or IT or HR team, you're thinking about how do you define that. There's no person in our organization that doesn't think about that. And I don't think you can confine it to a business unit,
right,
if you will.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. So there's those challenges then. How do you infuse that across the whole organization? And then you have the external, like working with the government in Vietnam or any of the other 9 countries you're in. And I think that kind of transitions nicely kind of to one of the big challenges with Curtis's work as well, thinking about the external environment, the limitations and possibilities, where often we think about the funding part, but I know you have some insights maybe to share about there also being policy and regulation. And
yeah, tech is in a really interesting spot for a lot of these concerns, because you look at this idea of organizational scale, like WhatsApp's Android team, I believe it was 1 billion users and it's 4 people, right? And so tech gives you a certain ability to scale, and then there's like Uber, right? Which is something that we deal with, this idea of like, well, this is illegal, so we can either spend 7 years pushing this through government or we can just do it. And to be clear, like our organization runs illegal cell phone networks on some continents because the regulations are behind and we know that. We tell the regulators there's nothing they can do and we're not gonna wait. But that obviously doesn't work for all organizations. When you're working with government primary schools, you kind of need to get the government involved. So these are sort of it's an interesting view to come in and say, how else could you do it were you to really, I would say, radicalize that piece of your agenda? And there's places in organizations and certain problems where that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate for us because we don't have to worry about those motivational problems. When we bring connectivity, no one argues with us that they don't want connectivity. It's always, it's a sort of seemingly universal good in a way I didn't anticipate when I started the project. And that allows us to duck a lot of those things. But again, it only works when it works. When it doesn't work, it like fails horribly if you avoid these actors. And that's probably the biggest limitation to our scaling at the moment, is that we're running into this, how much do we wait for the regulators? How much do we wait for the incumbents? And how much do we do on our own? And that's what we're figuring out.
Yeah, big challenges. I want to kind of continue and expand on that with you, Tevis, of this general idea of how do you go from the initial proof of principle, pilots, the competitions, and the design classes and awards across maybe some sort of valley of death towards an organization that's really scaling and really is an enterprise or an NGO of some sort. And I think we talk a lot about that transition, the valley of death, right? Borrowing from what happens in pharma, what happens in traditional enterprise. But it seems like perhaps the dimensions of it, from what we've heard from the last 3 panelists, are a bit different when you also have to emphasize the social in social enterprise. And maybe you can talk about that for your organization.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think I don't have the awesome luxury of a tech model that is just hyper scalable with a handful of people. And we're still in the sort of very early days of not being ready to sort of teach other forestry companies how to do this, because we have to prove that it's working, right? And we've scaled up to 5,000 farmers, 1 million trees. That's going to create a lot of impact for those farmers. But really, for this to be of relevance to, say, forestry private equity investors who have trillions of dollars under management, we need to be up at least 10x the scale. So 50,000 farmers and 10,000 hectares and a $5 million plywood mill. And once that's working and that's profitable, then that will be of very significant interest to everyone in the forestry world. Until then, it's a sort of nice little experiment. And like, good luck. And maybe I'll throw you a little bit of money. But until we've cracked that, we're still, I hope we're inching our way out of the valley of death. But in some capacity, we're in it. And I feel we're on the upslope of it. But forestry is just, it's incredibly challenging because we're doing behavior change for thousands and thousands of farmers. We're distributing highly perishable seedlings across awful, bumpy African roads. And anyone who will ever do microforestry will have to do exactly the same. Behavior change for mostly illiterate farmers who, why are they going to wait decades for income, blah, blah, blah. So it's a phenomenally hectic and complicated boots on the ground model. The upside, and I think where we're getting to why there's light at the end of the tunnel, is if you do connect all of these dots in a really complicated operating model, the income and impact returns to a farmer are truly transformative. So the model is designed to work specifically for dryland farmers growing maize, but maize doesn't grow where rain doesn't fall, but trees can. And so the impact story to anyone who cares about impact is incredibly strong. We're talking about getting farmers from extreme poverty well out of it, potentially on the way to the middle class within a generation, just from a couple acres of trees, right? It's equivalent to winning a lottery, just plant a few acres of trees. It takes time, and you got to cross your fingers that the market exists, but Komaza is there to solve all of that. I think that the really big challenge for us is proving that it works to investors, because to scale this up, not only is it incredibly operationally complex, it is a financing nightmare, because most of these funds have a 10-year cycle, and for forestry you need 15 years on the short end. So not only is it proving the impact story to funders and farmers, it's also proving the market opportunity and that, hey, we can actually connect the dots over several decades to make, high double-digit IRRs for our investors. And just the time scales involved with going from putting a seedling in the ground to selling an electricity pole are so long that it takes forever to get to that point when you can go knock on some big private equity or another plantation company and say, hey, why don't you try adopting this model that we've proven? So my hunch is it'll be another 5 years out of the valley of death, and then another 5 of scale, and then maybe the big players will pump potentially billions into this. The carrot is big enough that if it works, it could go big, but it's going to take us a lot of hard work to get there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. That sounds daunting and very promising and inspirational all at the same time. I'd like to open up the floor for questions. We have a microphone, I see, to hear what everyone is thinking about in this space. I can ask one while you think of it. I encourage you to come up and ask your questions as individual social entrepreneurs or about the bigger picture of how to support this as a movement through investment or other support mechanisms. I'd like to hear from any one of you that wants to jump in on this whole big challenge of balancing the different dimensions of scale. How do you balance growing financially with growing your social impact, with growing organization? Because they're intertwined, but at the same time, all of you have talked about in some way how they're distinct. And you could have a lot of financial impact and not a lot of social impact, and vice versa.
So there's an element of this that's like vaguely terrifying, right? Like, especially with me, I build these cell phone networks, and they're very applicable to other markets. And there's just a constant pressure to sort of move away from some of the social vision. And so in terms of where we're scaling up, it's just a hard line right now, and we just sort of say, this is what we're doing. We're not working in resource extraction at the moment. Maybe we'll change our mind at some point. And that it's just tough to like sort of sit there on that. I think that's a byproduct of the for-profit model, because everyone comes in with a very clear set of requirements and incentives. We have on our VCs, as some of our VCs are traditional VCs. They're not in this for the social mission. They believed our pitch on this being a big market that can go places, and the longer we go without demonstrating that, the more they're going to get antsy and want us to move to a different market. And I think it's just a byproduct of the for-profit model and fundamental to it.
Maybe to jump in with, so I agree with that in many scenarios, but I actually think it's a case-by-case model. So for us, the biggest question around sort of mission drift away from impact versus chasing your sort of investor returns boils down to land productivity, right? If you plant trees where soils are great and rains are plentiful, your trees grow really fast. So a normal investor profit-hungry guy would say, let's go and plant there. But interestingly, those farmers don't have the land. And where farmers have land is in dry lands, a huge abundance of land, and their opportunity cost is very low. And they're actually most willing to wait, which is sort of counterintuitive. So what we've found is that actually chasing the most commercially viable business model for us is fundamentally aligned with maximizing the impact for our farmers. We want each farmer to grow as many trees as possible with Komaza. We want the highest density of farmers in every location growing trees with Komaza. And the model works best in the poorest communities. So one of the original concerns of a lot of impact investors was, over time, as you bring on for-profit investors, are you going to move from these god-awful dry lands into the gorgeous Rift Valley, where if you spit on the ground, up pops a human? And the answer is no. We're going to stay in the dry lands because that's where there's land, right? That's also where there aren't any existing forestry companies, so the market is wide open for us to build a multi-decade monopoly if we do it right. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. It's not necessary that making impact means you're sacrificing IRR. There are a couple of bright spots out there, and generally you can't design it. I didn't design it. I stubbed my toe on it. And I might be wrong, but you know, it does look like there could be opportunities where maximum market opportunity and maximum impact actually go hand in hand. Yeah, I agree with that, and I think we make the same kind of pitch in Indaga. This is the bigger market. There's 1 billion people without coverage. There's resource extraction companies, but there's competition there. There's other people in place. There's other organizations in place. But there's always this feeling that if the market that I say is there doesn't materialize quick enough, there will be a push. And so it's all about how long that story will resonate with the investors. Because I think, yeah, we're doing the exact same thing in terms of this is the bigger market, and we believe it, but they may or may not.
I mean, I think for us, maybe it might be slightly different because we are so social impact driven. I mean, the only way that we raise money, the only way that we do anything is by being able to demonstrate, you know, high quality impact. So, you know, to get the government on board, to get investors on board, to be able to take on new projects, we have, you know, everything is driven by a set of metrics that we have that we look at our program quality first. And if we see a decrease, maybe there were, you know, challenges in the operational model. We weren't able to hire, you know, people fast enough to be able to do the coaching and the facilitation that it takes to build the capacity in the schools at the same rate that we thought we could. Then we will hold back in order to, because we will see our program quality being impacted, and we'll hold back funds or we'll hold back growth in order to ensure that we're delivering, you know, a quality intervention at the schools. And so I think for us, everything has been driven by a series of metrics, and it's been a pretty, you know, it's a beacon that we can look at. That is a, you know, we have, each of our countries has a dashboard. You know, they have, you know, very clearly they know when they're in the green zone, the yellow zone, or the red zone on a whole series of metrics that we have looked at. The first one's being program quality. Then we go through whole operational excellence, you know, their retention of their staff, their ability to, you know, the speed of being able to hire new people, their budget, you know, how they've been able to track towards their budget, all of those things. And then there is a funding piece which comes third, which is, you know, there are certain times when people come to us and maybe it's, you know, an Indian diaspora group that says we only want to invest in India. And so there may be times when we're able to surge ahead because we have, you know, a funding desire that has been expressed that has allowed us to expand in one area or the next. But that's always third compared to our program quality and our operational, you know, sort of metrics that we look at.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add one quick thing, and I know we're not talking about funding, so I'm going to talk about funders and skirt the issue. I think some of what's in what all of you talked about is your incentives. So you're talking about the VCs are incented a certain way. You've got a long lead time, so you need patient capital. You need them to be incented a certain way. And you guys are talking about social impact because that's the incentive that you're rewarded for. Yeah. And I think that there is this wide open gap that we just don't talk about enough about organizations retaining their power. So I, as someone who spent a lot longer in philanthropy than on the other side, would say I would roll my eyes every time an organization would come in and say, well, I know you care about blah, 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 and so this is what we do. And I'm like, you're lying. You are lying to me. And you're lying to me because the world that I live in is incenting you to lie. So, or incentivizing, whatever the word is. So ultimately, I think what's most there for the reach, if you will just grasp it, and John Wood, Aaron's co-founder, is excellent at this, is saying no to money. Yeah. Saying no to money that does not align with your North Star. And what I mean by North Star is what these guys all just said, of like, this is what we are looking for. And it's gonna be really big. It's gonna be a thriving forestry marketplace in unlikely land. Yeah. It's, you know, it's everyone has access to cell receptivity or something, you know, like the big, broad vision. You know, quality education. And I think that if you grasp that North Star and you find that there is an investor that says, okay, well, we want you to do this, and it's not aligned, walk away. And I know that sounds easier said than done because everybody's struggling for capital. But I can't tell you how many for-profit, you know, folks in the Valley say, I want to pick the VC that is aligned with me. That is, you know, I mean, not everybody gets the opportunity to have 6 term sheets, but it's something that we have to talk about, because if we continue down the land of bad behavior, we're going to continue to get these results, and we're going to continue to have organizations say, I am working in a market of 1 billion people, or, I mean, everyone working on sanitation would pitch me and say, did you know that 2.6 billion people lack access to clean water and sanitation? And I'll say, well, how many do you work with? And they'll say, 100. It's like, that's not your denominator. Your denominator may be trying to get to 10,000 people. That's your scale, not 2.6 billion. You got a long way to go before you're getting there. So it's about, let's have this real conversation about, you should be real, you should look for a real match, and it should be about, like, you own your impact vision and they own it too. Sorry, that's my little stump speech.
No, I mean, I think that's very accurate in a lot of ways. I mean, as I mentioned with my billion number, totally. Like,
I know.
Yeah.
Partly saying it too.
Everyone has a billion number.
Yeah. So, but as a follow-on to that, I think that the for-profit model is slightly different than that. I can definitely see like being able to pick your investors, but in the long-term vision of a for-profit company, it's a public company, and you're not picking anything.
Right.
They're coming in, and they're shareholders, and they're voting. And so at some point, that has to shift, right? Yeah. Is it just as part of scaling up, you're no longer doing that? Because at the early stages, yes, I mean, all our investors are on board with the vision. We weren't giving people different visions based on what we thought they wanted.
Right.
But in the long term, like, you can just tell it has to change.
I'm going to oh, you want to jump in really quick? And then we have a question. Yeah.
You don't have to go public as a for-profit company. Our intention is to keep Comasa private indefinitely. And I've said no to more money than I've said yes to. Because of exactly this reason. And if you keep it as a private company and are lucky enough to control it, it gives you the ability to stay true to your mission and that North Star. And I think what that really boils down to a theory of change, right? Is how do you make that change in the world? And for you, it's put in these awesome cell phone towers, and then people have phones. For us, it's let's scale a big, profitable forestry company, and by doing that, we'll be able to pump in a bunch more money to then plant with many, many more farmers. And so only if we are really profitable are we going to get our hands on a bunch of money, and then are we going to be able to plant with many, many more farmers down the road. If we fail on the business, we're going to fail to raise that big financing to grow, and then we're going to fail to have that impact at scale. So for us, the theory of change is build your awesome forestry business, get your hands on tens of millions of dollars, then change the lives of millions of farmers. But we have to sequence it that way.
And I think one of the biggest challenges is that people are not patient enough. Yeah. I think one of the challenges is, to stay on that true north and to know, I mean, I'm a big fan of Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, to really know the intersection between what you're deeply passionate about, what you're uniquely really good at, and what you can, build the resources and the model around. That intersection, that intersection is very hard for a lot of people first to figure it out, but once you do, you sort of think it'll be overnight success, right? And it doesn't. It's going to take a decade, as you said. It's going to take 2 or 3. Education by definition, you're putting people through school for 15, 18 years, right? So there's there are long lead times. I think we're so driven by what's the next quarter's results or even this year's results. It's often hard, I think, for people to stay and not have that program creep or not have that business creep where they think, oh, maybe we'll just go invent something here or go try that there. And that, I think, is something, at least, and we've seen a lot of, is not having the patience to really, focus and grow at a pace that may feel slow at times, but is actually ultimately getting you to a much stronger product or model that is able to scale.
Yeah. The patient question asker.
Hi, my name's Cameron Cross. I'm curious about experiences with discussions between early stage foundation teams, where you get to a point where you've got something, and then you need that extra little bit of 10% to just push it through. And that's when those conversations get really intense. And I'm curious to hear about that and what the resulting experiences are with what's the stake in the game for, foundation and then following leadership team that are required to get at that next 10%.
Do you want me to answer? That's the foundation representative on the committee. This is pretty related to what we were all just talking about, which is I would highly encourage folks to have a real and honest conversation. So if you can say, one of the things, this is a very California thing to say, but I often talk about street cred. So you need enough street cred to know that whoever you're trying to influence will listen to you, right? So it's impact metrics, or it's numbers of trees, or it's reach for your cell boxes. And it's about if you feel like you've gotten 90% of the way on your street cred, but you just need this little bit more to kind of prove it. I think the story that I wanted to hear, that I so often did not hear, was that thought chain of like, if we do, so I'll be really, really specific. If we hire 10 people who can do more business development for us to get more, a couple more like hospitals on board, and we then start to look like we have our tentacles into 15% of the marketplace, I think that then the rest of these guys who always follow what that 15% does anyway will then start to take us more seriously. But if I can't hire those 10 people, I can't get those, however many more hospitals, so I can't prove anything. And it's as you say, it becomes this like, if not the whole picture, like the proof kind of falls apart. And I would have loved to have that conversation more often. And what happens is program officers have to do it themselves. So you go and you talk to 30 people to try to get the truth. You try to, poke holes in all of this stuff, and you try to say, well, I thought like we did, let's talk fisheries. It's like, well, I thought based on this research, it looks like you need 25% of the marketplace to get the fisheries market to change. Why are these people saying 15%? And then you're, kind of circuitously trying to answer this stuff. Program officers' jobs are always going to try to like test whether it fits, right? Like that's the job. And any funder is going to necessarily have to say, I'm willing to take this risk with this capital, and there's often, funder egos involved and whatnot. I'm not too much of an idealist to know that. But I think that it's about having that clear chain of events in your mind to understand, like, if this, then this, then this. And we think these 6 things are going to go wrong here. We think these 10 things could go wrong here. And so if we had more staff who had these kinds of skills to help us figure that out, da-da-da-da. There's always going to be bumps in the road. My favorite example was Vision Spring said to get eyeglasses into Bangladesh, they needed 30 signatures on 1 box of eyeglasses to just get that first shipment in. So that first shipment took almost a year. But then they figured out exactly how you have to do what you have to do in order to get it to go faster. Well, if they just said, well, we're going to go Bangladesh next year, and then we're going to scale to 10 more after that, there wouldn't be any room for this, what it actually takes to get it done. So I'm going to sit here and continue to say, be honest, be truthful, know what your real denominator is, know what you're trying to prove, and take people on the long-term ride. But show them this is what street cred looks like, and this is what, if we're successful with the street cred, this is what we're trying to prove. But it's going to take all this to get there. And we may change our business model along the way.
I mean, I think part of what you're asking about, if I'm understanding your question, is also part of a team dynamic question. Mm-hmm. I will say, both in our own experience and having worked and advised a lot of other startups, I think there is, I'm a big fan of input by the many and decisions by the few, in the sense that you have to be really clear who is a decision maker mm-hmm. and who's going to be there for the long haul. There's a lot of creativity and innovation and new ideas, and that's all really important and great, but you need a pretty committed team to understand who's, again, going to be there for the long haul and wait this out 3 years, 5 years, get doors slammed in your face, figure out, who's really committed to that, and at the end of the day, they have to be pretty passionate, and they have to have a vision, they have to have a clear view, and, it may or may not be, right. At the end of the day, though, they're committed to waiting it out and working really hard. And I think in a lot of team dynamics, there's only probably a couple of people that really are the ones that are going to step up and in that sense kind of lead. So I do think there's again, deciding who really gets to make that decision is a really important one with a lot of these innovations. I also think there's a huge lack of appreciation for management and what it takes to run an organization, business or not for profit, but run an organization versus being the creative, designer, innovator, whether it's tech or non-tech, it doesn't really matter, but it's really easy, again, to, sort of create an idea. It's not that easy to implement and run a business and run it well. So I think there's also a need on all teams to really understand, just because you invented something doesn't mean you necessarily should be the CEO or you should be the one that is, sort of the one that executes and figures out how to, be on time, on task, on budget, hire the best people, retain the best people, develop, partnerships, all investor relationships. All of those things are part of what it takes to run an organization. And those skills sometimes are often missing on the creative innovation, team.
Last couple of thoughts to add on top of that. I agree with everything that's been said. There's no last 10% that you're talking about. You never get there. Yeah. You're always doing this. Yeah. So completely erase that from your mind as a concept. There's no finish line. The other is that any success with something like this is 1% innovation or idea, 99% implementation. And for that, it's almost the opposite side of that coin. It's not innovation. It is an incredible laser-like focus and ridiculously perseverant hustle. Yeah. Knocking on doors, getting said, no, 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 I'm still going to hustle. And so innovation's great, but innovation without focus and hustle is just a bunch of scribbles on a whiteboard. And I did those scribbles on a whiteboard at the age of 21 and over a period of about 3 weeks in college. And I've spent the last decade trying to implement, and I'll spend another 2 to 3 doing it. So innovation, like, no offense, I love innovation. Innovation's cheap. Implementation is what's hard and where the lack of resources is.
Yeah. Do we have anyone else with a microphone? There we go.
So going back to actually earlier, you talked a little bit about this, that it took 7 years for in Vietnam to actually adopt this really great idea. So what are some of the challenges along that one, and also lessons learned, especially with social impact-driven programs and or organizations when it comes to getting other people's buy-in? So the people, the decision makers, the other players, not necessarily funders, I think that comes a little later, but again, from the beginning, say, hey, this is a great idea. Instead of 5 minutes, how about 30 minutes? How do you even get people to like open the door, people that you actually need to work with?
Yeah, my number one advice on that question is I think we suffer, still as a world oftentimes of inventing solutions to problems that we're not really sure, exist. Right? I think you have to really work with the group very closely that you're trying to impact. I think we have a lot of shoulds. People should be doing this with water, and they should be doing that with the resources that we think this will be a great product that so-and-so will use and adopt and scale. But, again, the world is littered with great ideas that, coulda, shoulda, woulda. But the reality is I think there's a lot less time spent with your community, however that is defined, and spent in a way that has them take ownership and understand whether this actually is a solution to, first of all, what is their actual problem, is a solution to their problem, and are you being able to work in a collaborative way so that there's ownership. So for us, we spent a lot of time in schools working with teachers and parents and students. I mean, with our local language publishing books that we are a large publisher of children's content, we actually go out and field test these with students. And you know what? They will tell you very clearly if that story sucks, and they don't really care whether you think it's a great topic and book that they should read, but they'll tell you which ones are popular and which books they want to read. Teachers will tell you what's easy for them to do and what is just totally overwhelming for them to do in a classroom. And so whatever that looks like in your world, I think there has to be a lot more of that collaboration to really be developing ideas and processes and innovations that will really be useful and adopted. Sorry.
I just want to say one thing. My dirty little secret is I worked in direct marketing for a bunch of years and for tech companies. And there is a tool that most marketers use, most agencies use, called a creative brief. And the brief is basically, who is your customer? How do they think? What do they want? How does this product fit into their world? How are they incentivized? A whole number of things. Where do they get information from? I have been somewhat shocked in making that transition from marketing into more of the social impact space, that organizations don't have a creative brief. Because to me, it just seems so obvious to figure out, kind of think about your stakeholders from the beginning. And I could imagine you having, you guys could have a creative brief for the girl, right? You could have a creative brief for the parent. You could have a creative brief for the teacher. You could have a creative brief for the government official. And that could be a really great way to help you understand, these are our 4 main stakeholders. I don't want to minimize this, but 4 main stakeholders, and here's how they think, which would help you understand of how would they be more likely to make this change or behavior change, which is always the hardest thing. So I'm just going to throw that out there because I think, embrace the creative brief. Think about your customer.
I would like to maybe continue on one topic I think we haven't touched on so much. That's you kind of skirted by talking about the books and printing of books. It might be if you're starting a company in Silicon Valley, it might be true that software is eating the world, but you all have actual real products that have to move. You have to have trees that can be planted, tree seedlings. You have to have cell phone tower infrastructure that gets to a village. You have to have books that are printed, building materials that get to the right place to build a school and so on. So can you guys maybe talk a little bit about how do you make 10,000 of something, the challenge of that, or how do you get those building materials to the right place? What happens when the answer isn't an app, but something actually has to get between places?
Everyone looked at me. We do a lot of trucking. So it depends. In the early days of founding something, I did a lot of it and worked there with the team and unload crates of seedlings and learn it from a very hands-on perspective. I think that one of the unfortunate things about being a founder is you get to do all the hands-on stuff and you fall in love with that in the early days, and then pretty quickly you become a fundraiser, which is just the bane of every founder's existence. And so now the way I personally solve things like that is smart people plus money. And manage them decently well. And all right, it's your job to move trees from A to B. Here's your budget. Good luck. And that from my perspective, so that's how I do it, right? I don't actually move stuff from A to B much anymore. But I mean, it boils down to sort of what are you moving and getting the team in place. I think sort of gets back to talent and team to make it happen.
Yeah, and core to our model is that we do it in whatever way is most locally appropriate. All of our staff in our countries that we work in are all local nationals of their own country and are deeply ingrained in how to make things happen within the context that they live in. So there is no expatriate staff going around saying, hey, this is how education should happen in Zambia. I mean, this is all, they understand the education system, they understand how it works, they understand the publishing, we hire people out of the publishing world, we hire people out of the curriculum design world, out of different, women's empowerment group that come in to design our life skills curriculum. So everything is very different. If you show up and you see a library in Sri Lanka versus a library in Tanzania in Roomtree's world, they should look different, and they are very different. And how it all happened is within whatever is the lowest cost, most efficient way to happen. I mean, we have great photos that we actually do show in the fundraising world around like how does a library happen in Bangladesh? Here's a bicycle that went out and biked for 4 hours to get the bookshelves and the books in the middle of rural Bangladesh, and that's the best way to get it done. And so we try to build off of what is already that know-how that it does exist.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I would want to impart upon the audience here is just like how much it simplifies things to be in the for-profit space on this, right? Like there's a firm, they're in China, we pay them. And then we get boxes. And then if you go to Ubiquity's website, there's a list of distributors for, this is a long-distance Wi-Fi company. You give them boxes, and they like, there's all these pieces where once everyone is for-profit, the incentives are trivial. And moving away from that, then things get complicated. Then you have to deal with motivating people and changing behaviors. And I don't change anyone's behavior. I leverage their existing behavior. Because their existing behavior is I pay them and they do a thing. Or it's very other simple models. And so this is one of the big advantages of tech. Why tech is so fast is that all of this infrastructure is in place. There's a firm in the South Bay that just does manufacturing of hardware. And this is how Nest got built. This is how all these hardware companies, you just give them a design, they build it, they give it back to you, you pay them, and then it gets shipped off and manufactured. And this accelerator has been so useful. You obviously can't do that with seeds. But for hardware and for tech, it's just all there, and it's great. And that's exactly why we're for-profit in this space, to try to leverage as much of that as we can.
I think tech breaks a lot of the rules that a lot of the rest of us struggle with. Tech's a huge, huge opportunity where it is more about the innovation than the there's obviously implementation too, but tech does break a lot of the other rules in an amazingly high impact way.
Yeah, there's downside to it too, where there's obviously like a lot of over-innovation in tech, where we have these wonderful projects that come along that are completely ungrounded and have no idea what they're doing and all this. But if you come into tech with a little bit of background on actually getting things done in the real world, what I've seen is that people like that can have a pretty big impact.
This is not my idea, so I'm stealing it. But there are a lot of smart people in the audience, so I think you should go create this. I was talking to another investor the other day, and he said, one of the things that drives me the most crazy is I keep funding organizations to go start up in new countries. And so essentially, that isn't their program, that isn't their innovation, it's operations. It's like, how do you find an office in a new country? How do you find the right, local team to help you procure things? This is basic operation stuff. Or FedEx in one place and DHL in another place. And he said, what I don't understand is why is there not some sort of intermediary organization that just does this? So they're like your handlers, and you come in, the UN has kind of created some of this, but it's you come in and they're like your early handlers. He's like, I would love to see that company built. So maybe it has a lower profit margin because they're helping nonprofits instead of for-profits, but wouldn't the cost per intervention for the nonprofit be a whole lot lower if that basic common operation stuff were outsourced? And how come we don't have more outsourced organizations that you can then layer on top of, kind of cribbing from a lot of the stuff that goes on in for-profit? And so I told him, of course, to go use his money to start that, because doesn't that sound great? But I just put that out there because I think this question of what is it that's different about what you do versus what's common in a lot of other organizations that are also trying to start up in that context. Could you just have that intermediary in place? Do you agree with that?
I have a question for you, actually.
I'm sure I don't have an answer.
I wore an academic hat for a long time, may put it back on at some point, but there's always been this discussion of a similar infrastructure for academics. And they've tried them, and they've generally not worked because basically, as an academic, going and paying a firm to do some of your work, it seems bad.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the nonprofit space, if there was a big for-profit that just like helped manage nonprofits moving into countries, that would be viewed as bad. Like that firm was
and I think that's why it doesn't
exploitive.
exist. So here's the thing: is what if that weren't a for-profit firm, but what if that were? Look, I'm like also in one of my big strong opinions. I hate that impact investing has become this like upper right-hand corner thing where you get a 25% return and like the world changes. Most things happen much closer in to a 4% return and decent social good. So like, I would love to see a low profit or maybe, you know, break even model. And what I would love to see is there are big infrastructure companies, Halliburton, these kinds of things, who need to do some good. And it would be really interesting to see if they could, or others, I mean, I don't know, I'm just brainstorming, but like, I would love to know if there was some sort of intermediary, because what I would argue is like setting up an office is not the intervention. Like you would layer that program on top. So with the academic stuff, I think why, you know, stuff like that wouldn't work is because it's too nuanced. You would need to do it yourself. What I'm talking about is the stuff that isn't nuanced. The stuff of like, how do you find 10 shipping companies, trucking companies in the location that you're in? Why does everyone do that themselves? I just don't know why. I don't know. Just saying.
For me, it's because they don't exist. But I think there are lots of places where they do.
Go make them.
No. So I mean, there are especially urban opportunities.
Yes.
You know, I think it is really context specific. If you're working out in the middle of nowhere and there's no seedling nursery for 500 kilometers, you got to build your own. You can't outsource it.
Well, if you
No
have that
trucks,
idea,
whatever.
go talk to Larry Gilson at Focusing Philanthropy, because he's
There
the
you
one
go.
who came up with the idea. He'll fund it. Just kidding.
So one thing.
It is not.
Just yell.
So one thing that we talk about a lot is hypothesis testing in growing organizations or growing ideas. And so I was just wondering for each of you guys, if you could talk about a hypothesis that you had, and then when you tested it, just didn't work, and how that kind of changed your organization or how you kind of pivoted around that idea.
Yeah, we actually started off with as part of our programs, a computer lab, talking about technology, computer lab program, where we had the bright idea sitting here in Silicon Valley that, you know, all schools should have computer labs. And, you know, it was a very expensive intervention, obviously, in the countries that, you know, we work in, like Nepal, Cambodia, Laos, et cetera. There was not, I mean, it's gotten better, but there was not, you know, a lot of ISPs, there was not a lot of, you know, sort of the infrastructure to piggyback off of. So, and then, you know, the biggest thing actually was that as soon as we implemented the lab and trained the teacher and went through an intensive training, the teachers would go down to the next nearest city and get a job in an internet cafe for like 3 times the cost of being a teacher. And of course they would take their best teachers and say, you know, you become the computer, you know, lab teachers is a great opportunity. So we're actually doing more harm, you know, in the sense that we're taking great teaching professionals out of their profession. You know, you could argue in the greater world if they had other skills and were able to be employed at a higher level. I mean, you can go through that argument, but at least in the short term, you know, we didn't feel that we were adding a lot of value because it was a very high cost program and it was very difficult. It was a big burden on the schools, and the human capacity component of it was very challenging to solve. So we just shut it down. We actually had a gathering of people who were working in this space that, you know, not with Room to Read, but just experts in this space to try to challenge our thinking of like, how can we look at this differently? We invited our investors into that gathering. We have a tradition at Room to Read called a convening of critical friends, where we ask people that are, you know, don't work and breathe and live Room to Read, so they can come in and just throw bombs into the room and say, this sucks, why do you guys do this? And, you know, it's a time-honored tradition. We do a couple of them a year on different challenges that we have, and they just, by the end of the 2-day session, everyone said, yeah, you should just shut down that program. That sucks, that's a bad idea. It's not working. And so we did. We said, you know, we phased it out. This is not the place where we can add the most value. Now, there's a lot, that was, you know, 10 years ago, so there's a lot of different, you know, aspects of technology that have improved in the countries we're working in. But that's an example where I think you really should, you know, it is like you were saying, the iteration. I mean, there is no, you never know when you're going to get to the end. You think you have a great idea and you start it, and you have to keep looking at the metrics. Are we really having impact? And if we're not, don't be afraid to pivot and say this was, you know, this is not adding, you know, value.
Yeah, there's an adage in engineering of fail early, fail often. And I have some similar stories. They're not quite as good as that one, so I won't tell them. But like this is, this was an academic project at its start, and there were numerous tipping points throughout the process. And it's always been like, let's test it as soon as possible so that we know that this is not the way to go. And now that's given us sort of a high degree of focus on the product we have now, which is the one that was successful and was clearly successful. My favorite version of this was the guy who built Pac-Man. He had built a whole bunch of games, and like none of them had really done that well. And then Pac-Man, and then he had a line of 30 people in front of Pac-Man. He's like, I got it. So then they scaled up that. And so fail early, fail often is, I think, one thing that is very easy to do in tech, and I think well built into the for-profit model, but something that's harder to do in the nonprofit model because there's a lot of babies. Like in the sense that it's my baby, we want to carry this forward. And throwing those out is hard. So that's like, if that was your first project, that's kind of amazing that you guys were able to sort of like, all right, move on to the next one. That's really hard to do.
Well, and also let's just not lose the point that Aaron said about bringing the investors in to help think about it, because the part being a for-profit that sometimes you don't see is a lot of funders in nonprofit will tie you to an outcome before you've even tested it. So then you've learned it doesn't work, but you have to continue to do it because that's what your money is restricted to do. So we have to prove why unrestricted is better, but in the same time, bringing them in and saying, you could keep funding this and it doesn't work and we're doing more harm than good is a really, really good way to repivot money.
Nothing serious to add. We've failed with all sorts of things, and we say no to those failures all the time.
I'm curious, Kimberly, on this same question, since you've had the opportunity to see a large number of social enterprises over time, are the kind of pitfalls people are running into and struggling with changing? Are we getting more sophisticated as a field, or are you seeing the same things again and again?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, I would love to think I was well positioned to answer it. I mean, I'll give it a shot, but I think I don't know, it's a hard question. I would say that if we really, really boiled things down, it is about the how, right? It's about who's doing it, what your business model is, how you iterate, so how you learn from those failures and shift. So that goes to culture. And also kind of, generally how you think about your attachment to your mission. So we used to joke at the Skoll Foundation that we found really egotistical social entrepreneurs, but they had ego for the cause, not for themselves. And it was something that one of the most successful organizations we would see were those where the leaders at the top, and not just the one or two people, but the team that's really doing the work, were all celebrating the 5 to 30 minute win. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like I now was invited to go to this fancy gathering. It was we finally got the 30 minutes and like, let's throw a party, right? So I think that the pitfalls I see over and over again are when you have the wrong staff and you don't fire them fast enough. You have the right business model, and if you just lifted your head up, it would be staring you in the face, but you're so committed to doing it exactly that way that you're gonna do it come hell or high water. There are a lot of organizations that should go out of business that don't, and they need to have ego for the cause and say, look, we're not achieving this, and we've tried to pivot 3 different ways, and this isn't the right way. And the other big failure I often see, which again I would say is an ecosystem failure, not necessarily each organization, because we're not incentivizing it in the ecosystem, but would be partnering. I was so sick of organization. I mean, like I said, I probably saw 300 organizations a year, right? I was so sick of organizations sitting in front of me and saying, no one has ever done this before. And I would laugh, and I would let them keep going, and I'd be like, I can name 10, and I haven't even gone to my computer yet, right? Like, I think that we have to have an awareness of our competitive environment. If somebody's already doing it, go join them. If you've got a great idea, go be what they call an intrapreneur, right? Go join another team. If you've got a good add-on to another organization, go to that organization. I don't know if folks know Blue Planet Run, or Blue Planet Foundation, I guess they're called now, but they just made a big pivot where they folded their work into another organization. Bechtel funded them to do it because they went to Bechtel, who was a big funder of both of them, and they said, this is stupid, we're both doing very similar things. But that took really great leadership, and Lisa, who's another example of ego for the mission, not for herself. And it took her saying, this is stupid, this is a waste of everybody's money. So I think, you know, things like that I would just see over and over again. I would love to see us mature, but I don't know if, you know, we don't talk about failure loudly enough to learn, I think.
I will say, I think one thing that has been interesting to see, I mean, when Room to Read started, the term social entrepreneur didn't even exist. Yeah. And one day somebody said, hey, you're a social entrepreneur. It's like, wow, that's cool. What is that? And of course, it took like 5 years before anyone really could define it. And was it for-profit, non-profit, hybrid? And I think we're still, you know, having a lot of the same debates. But it was, you know, it didn't even exist in the, you know, the world. And then it started to become this really big trend, and everyone wanted to be a social entrepreneur. And that's where, you know, again, I caution, like, okay, it does take, you know, some commitment and long haul. These are not, you know, 3 months, 6 months projects. These are decade-long projects to really create, you know, an impact on a major social issue in the world. And so then I think it's become probably, you know, a little bit more integrated now, I think, into just the way, I mean, all of you wake up and you think about business and social impact very integrated from what I have seen. And that's actually really fascinating. Like, there isn't as much of a distinction, and the lines are blurred between what all of these, you know, sort of ways of operating are. And at least, you know, the people that we interact with and we hire, they're like, you know, there's no way I would work for something I didn't care about. There's no way I would spend my time, you know, without it being aligned with my personal values, the way I want to show up in the world, how I want to spend my time. And that has become very common and very mainstream, which was not the case 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's actually exciting, because I think that's actually unlocking a lot of human potential that is, you know, when you look at what, you know, in terms of, you know, the judging process, when you look at the quality of the plans and that are coming, I've been involved with GSVC for many years and seen them over the years. They're incredible now, and they're really well thought out, and they're already tested. There's lots of customer feedback. There's, you know, well thought out models. And so these things, I think, are iterating at a much faster rate, and it's just becoming the norm rather than this outlier. And I think that's, for the world and for solving a lot of these big social problems that we have, I think that's very exciting.
That's a great point. I think the thing I would add to that that has also changed is things used to be so siloed by issue, and I think we're starting to see that kind of regardless of issue, a lot of business models have a lot of things in common, and the beauty of business competitions and also just a lot of convenings that have been happening a lot more recently starts to see that somebody who's working in health might have more to add to your education organization just because your business models are really similar. But you know, you kind of see a lot of that cross-sector, cross-issue collaboration happening much more than we ever did, you know, 10 years ago. And it's a big piece.
Things are happening. I think that's a fantastic positive note after all the discussion of failure and pitfalls to end at. And then maybe we can all talk to the panelists after the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.